Welcome to this special Queensland Media Club panel event. I'm Peter Kelly from 3Plus and I'll be sharing the MC duties today with Bill McDonald. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Agara and Turrbal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Queensland Media Club is the official political, business and media forum of the Queensland Parliament Media Gallery and the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance. The Parliamentary Media Gallery uses proceeds from these events to support new journalists as well as charitable causes. The MEAA uses its share of the proceeds to support professional development and welfare activities for its members. We're able to present these events only through the generous support of our event partners, and I'd like to acknowledge them now. Our naming rights sponsors for 2019-2020 are Brisbane Airport Corporation, the operator of Brisbane Airport, a multi-award winning premier gateway to Queensland, welcoming more than 23 million passengers a year. Dial Before You Dig, a national referral service for information on the location of utilities' underground assets anywhere in Australia. And Griffith University, created to be a different kind of university, challenging conventions, creating bold new trends and pioneering solutions. Ranked in the top 2% of universities worldwide, its future-focused degrees are developed in consultation with industry, based on cutting-edge research and taught by Australia's most awarded teachers. Please thank our naming rights sponsors. This year's season partner is Arrow Energy, an integrated CSG company working to meet domestic and international demand for cleaner energy. And our club partners are New Hope Group, a majority Australian-owned, Queensland-based diversified energy company with business interests and operations spanning coal mining, agriculture, exploration, port operation, oil and innovative technologies. Telstra, whose purpose is to build a connected future so everyone can thrive. With a long and proud history of contributing to Queensland's economic and social development, Telstra is committed to staying close to its customers and providing them with the best experience, delivering the best tech on the best network. And Shell QGC, one of Australia's leading natural gas producers, focused on developing Queensland's world-class onshore gas reserves, as well as the Queensland Futures Institute, a unique partnership of academic, business, community and social services, as well as government, industry and research organisations that seek to foster economic and social growth through a collaborative public policy reform. Please thank our season and club partners. Our venue partner is the Brisbane Convention and Exhibition Centre, named the world's best convention centre and one of Queensland's great success stories. This venue brings unmatched capability and expertise to deliver a next-level experience in dining and deliver outstanding events, and has secured more than 1,480 future events for the BCEC through to 2029, as well as the managers of the Queensland Media Club, 3Plus, who are specialists in risk and reputation management and strategic communication. Please thank our venue partner and our managers. And of course, we welcome additional sponsors for the Queensland Media Club. If you're interested, please see me or any of the QMC team in the foyer after the event. Now, it's 10 years last month that the plan to develop the world's first coal seam to LNG export industry, the Bligh government's blueprint for Queensland's LNG industry, was released. 4 leaders of Queensland's gas industry have taken up our invitation to reflect on the highs and lows in the maturation of the industry since then and discuss how it will fit in a clean energy future. Santos is represented today by the company's Executive Vice President for Onshore Oil and Gas, David Banks. Santos is a proudly Australian company with a strong history as a leading supplier of natural gas. In Queensland, its Roma field has supplied homes in the region for the past 50 years. Santos created its GLNG project in 2007, involving gas field development in the Bowen and Surat Basin, a 420-kilometre underground transmission pipeline and a 2-train LNG processing facility on Curtis Island at Gladstone. Last year, Santos drilled a record 305 wells. This year, it's set to break that record with more than 350. Santos sees decades of development operation ahead for the Surat Basin and is committed to unlocking that resource. We also welcome Senex Managing Director and CEO Ian Davies today. Senex is a growing explorer and producer that's been part of the Surat Basin for about the past 5 years. It's developing 2 projects there, one near Roma called Roma North that will supply GLNG, and the other is Project Atlas near Wandoan. It's the first domestic-only gas acreage awarded by the Queensland Government and will supply customers by late this year, supporting hundreds of jobs at manufacturers in Queensland, such as building products maker CSR and packaging companies Aurora and OI. Each of these developments has involved construction of a gas processing facility and a pipeline. About 110 wells will be drilled for both projects over the next year, about 50 for Roma North and about 60 for Project Atlas, to deliver a Surat Basin gas production rate of 18 petajoules per annum by the end of the 2021 financial year. Shell Australia is one of Australia's leading natural gas producers, with its QGC venture producing natural gas from the Surat. It supplies both the Australian domestic and export markets via LNG, via its two-train liquefaction plant at Curtis Island. Today we welcome Shell Australia's Vice President Commercial and New Business Development, Cecile Wake. Our fourth guest today is from APIA, the peak national body for Australia's oil and gas exploration and production industry. APIA represents almost 200 companies involved in oil and gas exploration and production, as well as the provision of goods and services to the upstream and oil and gas industry. It's represented today by CEO Andrew McConville. Our guest speakers will be back on stage after our meal for a panel discussion with Bill McDonald. Today's event coincides with the release of a longitudinal study into the economic and social impact of the gas industry in Queensland for the 6 years from 2011 to 2012. You have at your table a snapshot of that report with a few big numbers. Some of those are that there's more than 4,600 jobs for Queensland come out of the industry, more than $54 billion in spending in Queensland businesses, more than $300 million in payments to councils, more than $500 million in payments to landholders, and nearly $500 million in royalties to the state. These figures go some way to explaining the true value of gas in Queensland. After lunch, our guests will tell you more of that story. We invite those of you on Twitter to join the conversation today by using the hashtag #GasFuture. Enjoy your meal.
My name's Bill McDonald. I'm, the moderator today for our Q&A chat. I hope you've all enjoyed lunch this afternoon here at the Convention Centre, a beautiful meal. Looking forward to being here today at the Queensland Media Club Showcase for Queensland's gas industry. And we were just talking at the main table there. I had the privilege a few weeks ago of taking a bit of a whistle-stop tour, if you like, out through Toowoomba, out through Chinchilla, out to Roma as well. And it was just an opportunity through APIA to say thank you to the communities out there that are impacted and have, well, not so much impacted, but have the LNG gas industry right on their doorstep. They're part of it, they're living it, they're working it. And I have to say it was an absolute eye-opener. The scale, the size, and the way the communities have embraced it, it was fascinating. So I'm looking forward to this chat today with our special guests. So without any further ado, I'll introduce them because we're told that the Minister, Anthony Lynham, is also trying to make his way over from Parliament. It's a sitting week. He's obviously found out there's a free lunch on, so he's going to try and make his way over here pretty soon for our chat as well. Okay, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, to invite them up to our lounge chairs, if you like, from Santos. I'll introduce them again. The Executive Vice President Onshore Oil and Gas, Mr. David Banks. From Senex, Managing Director and CEO, Ian Davies. And from Shell Australia, Vice President Commercial and New Business Development, Cecile Wake. And from the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, APIA, the CEO, Andrew McConville as well. Thanks all for being part of this today. Looking forward to the chat, as I said. Now, good to see Andrew again. We caught up out in Toowoomba, and that was a good little experience, wasn't it? Getting out and doing some trips out west. Yeah,
it was. I mean, I think it was really an opportunity, as you say, to engage with the community and say thanks in many ways. I think, you know, when the industry started to really develop at a scale, I think there were some missteps that were made, particularly the way in which we engage with some of the communities and some of the farming communities in particular. The good news is I think the industry has learned as we've gone along, and you know, in most places now, the industry is very much embraced as an important part of those communities. And obviously the study that you've all got there goes to the economic benefits. But I think it's more the social benefits in terms of actually being a genuine part of the community. And that was our way of sort of saying thanks. And it was really pleasing to see the engagement across all of those communities, Toowoomba, Dalby, Chinchilla, Roma, that absolutely the industry is now part of the community, as it should be.
It certainly was. Now, we'll be heard at the start as well. Peter Kelly mentioned some significant numbers, and they are substantial figures about the industry. Are these the sort of hard metrics that should be used to measure the industry's contribution, I guess, to society and these communities? And if not, is there a better way or a different way that it should be measured? I don't know who'd like to take that one.
Yeah, I'll start. I think they're indicative of the amount of investment, obviously, that's going into those communities. But for every dollar that's invested, there's a huge economic multiplier. But beyond just the dollars, it's the legacy that is delivered to the communities for generations to come. So for example, we've put a couple of $100 million into roads infrastructure around the Maranoa area, and that has a legacy for generations, making roads safer. You look at the Roma Airport. It's been upgraded through industry participation. The Life Flight service, which we all contribute to, which services the community and really does provide some essential services that, but for the industry, would not be there. Beyond that, you look at between all of us here, the amount of local companies that we invest in, and they're sourcing jobs locally. We source jobs locally, and that just has a ripple effect through the whole community. You mentioned you're up in Roma just recently. Roma is absolutely buzzing. It is a town on the move.
I was shown at one of the big facilities up there with Santos, and I was staggered at the amount of money that is injected back into that local community to stock that big warehouse, or not a warehouse, it was a massive facility.
Yeah, so we're running pretty much all of our Queensland logistics and some of our South Australia logistics through our Roma hub. Our investment through local service companies last year was about $100 million, and I'm sure other panel participants are investing similar amounts of money in local companies. And those local companies they're helping us innovate and drive cost out of our business, which allows us to develop more marginal resource and create a longer running industry than we see today.
I guess you'd agree?
Yeah, I think allied with that massive scale of investment that by any objective measure is huge, and oftentimes we find it hard to translate those numbers into things that are on the ground. But what makes me most proud is that certainly when we sanctioned the QCLNG project back in October 2010, we made a commitment that we would be really good neighbours to the communities in which we operate. And so seeing that legacy that David alluded to, and I think that is magnified across not just the CSG to LNG projects, but all of the players in our industry in Queensland, but really thinking how does that translate in personal terms for the people who live and work in those communities, and seeing young people in those communities who previously may have had to leave the regions in order to fulfil career aspirations or to find work, and seeing the number of apprenticeships, of traineeships, of people from regional communities who have come into town, gone to university, and are now back out living, raising their own families, and fulfilling their career aspirations in the industry is really, really satisfying and fulfilling.
And just to add to that, I think legacy is an amazing word for it. And I started in the industry before the LNG investments came to Australia, before the international businesses came to Australia. And if you look at a town like Chinchilla, I'm not sure how many people have been to Chinchilla, before 2010, it was a town that was basically dying. There was no Woolworths or Coles, the banks were leaving, and I remember trying to find lunch in the main street, and you end up at the only fish and chip place in town, because there's literally nowhere else. And anyone who's been there now, after the huge investment that's gone into towns like Chinchilla, and there are many others similar, it has one of the flashiest McDonald's I've ever seen. It's got full services, the health increases in these regional towns, the education outcomes in the regional towns it beggars belief compared to what was there previously. And that's on the back of fundamentally, it's not all resources obviously, but it's all the resource investment drove a lot of that investment.
I saw that McDonald's. We may have even visited there just quietly, and I can tell you what, we ticked over the till at the Chinchilla Golf Club while we were there as well. I don't think it stayed open that late, but anyway, we had a good time.
I think perhaps not the McDonald's, but certainly the pub test. I was out in Chinchilla a couple of weeks ago, and certainly you walk into any pub in Chinchilla, and they are full every night of the week, serving counter meals, and I think that's a pretty easy test. I was first in Chinchilla as an 11-year-old out for a swimming carnival, and it was a beautiful town then, but as Ian said, the vibrancy, the excitement, the services and opportunities in that town now compared to then are really quite extraordinary.
Well, Peter mentioned also earlier that it's been 10 years since that blueprint for Queensland's LNG industry was released. Of course, the plan to develop the world's first coal seam gas to LNG export industry. It was backed by both sides of Queensland government, Queensland Parliament. Politics, of course, has a lot of risk attached to it these days. Is there still support on both sides?
Yeah, I think there is, Bill. And I mean, Queensland in many ways enjoys an advantage that perhaps some of our southern neighbours do not. And you know, as an industry association, it's a real pleasure to be able to work here in Queensland where there is strong bipartisan support. Also the case in WA as well. I think it's where governments actually realise the significant benefits that these industries bring, not just in terms of you know, the production, but the related jobs, export revenue, all these things, royalties and so on. And you know, to play in this industry with the long-term investment horizons that are required, you absolutely need bipartisan support. And you know, perhaps Canberra is symptomatic of how challenging it can become when politics become split. And it's very unfortunate. You know, I spent 25 years in agriculture, and it was really agriculture and resources that enjoyed strong bipartisan support. And both industries are now struggling with that bipartisan support. And as a consequence, the policy debate and the rhetoric around it sort of drops down immediately. So I think Queensland is very fortunate, and long may it continue. I think it gets increasingly difficult with the nature of politics in Australia now, but certainly I think we need to continue to do everything, and it's up to every one of us in the room to really drive that that important debate to make sure that bipartisan support remains, because otherwise the industry will find itself in very, very difficult waters.
And I think just to add to that, echo the comments totally. I think one of the issues that happens in politics in Australia, first of all, the federation complicates things because it's a federation. So you naturally get tension, let's call it tension, between state and federal policies, both sides of the aisle, which leads to poor planning and poor outcomes, because they are decade-long investments required to invest in this sort of industry. But on top of that, you've got states that have their own renewables policies which distort investment. New South Wales imports 95% of the gas, and I know Santos are doing a huge amount of work to try and fix a big portion of that. And it really is a very, very difficult state of affairs when you've got some states doing their heavy lifting, and Queensland's a classic example of that, producing a huge amount of gas supply for the entire East Coast. Whilst gas in particular is declining in southern states, which is fundamentally where the manufacturing demand is. Unfortunately, there's no easy solutions, but certainly lifting moratoria from the likes of Victoria and New South Wales would be an amazing start.
Yeah, I'd build on what Ian says there, that you know, Queensland is almost the role model for not only bipartisan support, but also how the regulatory environment has emerged. It's been done in consultation with industry and other stakeholders, And when we have issues, there's an open conversation to be had, and it's a mature conversation. In other states, you know, we're at the very early stages, as Ian pointed out, in New South Wales. We've been trying to get a project up for 6-7 years now. We're optimistic that will be determined this year, which will be fantastic, and that's self-help for New South Wales. You know, the best option for this country to keep a lid on gas prices is to produce more gas domestically, and these moratoria do not help. Now, you look at the Northern Territory, sure, they went through a couple of years of hand-wringing, you know, brought in scientists from all over the world, and the you know, the Pepper inquiry found that you know, the resources could be developed safely, and the Northern Territory is starting to work through you know, some of those regulatory frameworks and so forth that are required, and they do look to Queensland as a bit of an exemplar to show how industry and government can work together in the best interests of, you know, ultimately the nation, you know, in terms of creating value for the country.
So you think maybe this year that project may get a tick? Well, could that open the floodgates, or how confident are you?
I'm not sure if that's been said before. We're certainly very optimistic that determination will come this year, and you know, we're working very closely with the New South Wales government, you know, answering all of their questions and providing the science that we need to provide, and hopefully we get the green light very soon.
I think just turning to the level of support that the industry's enjoyed here in Queensland from both sides of the aisle. For me, that's really come in two ways. First of all, a preparedness to be vocal in its advocacy for the industry and the benefits that it brings, and not all governments are prepared to stand up and be counted on that. But secondly, and perhaps more significantly, a willingness to roll up the sleeves and work with us to tackle some of the issues that we needed to tackle to deliver these massive capital projects, to do so in a way that benefited communities. So examples that jump out for me are the really collaborative dual industry and government work that was done with overlapping tenures, and also the amendments to the Petroleum and Gas Act that were made in the early stages of the capital projects to allow cross-tenement infrastructure. Now that sounds fairly dry, but what it actually means is that we could have centralised water treatment plants and gas processing facilities, which meant that instead of replicating them on every single one of the petroleum leases and having a much greater impact on landowners and the communities where we were able to deliver those more efficiently with much lesser impact on local communities. And those weren't those weren't easy things for government to put through Parliament. And I think there was leadership, there was courage, and there was support for the industry. And it'd be fantastic if that was replicated around the country.
One of the big things in the early days that was feared was that the gas industry was going to contaminate or was going to drain the aquifers that, in terms of farming in the Surat Basin. Maybe you could tell us what happens with the water today and that process.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think, you know, the Great Artesian Basin is an absolutely crucial national resource, and I think that the concerns and the focus that had in the early stages of our projects was absolutely right. What makes me really proud is that what started as a source of concern or fear for our communities has actually, through the delivery of our projects, been shown to be a really positive benefit for those communities. Rather than taking from the Great Artesian Basin, what we actually do is produce water that is otherwise trapped in the coal seams. We produce it to surface. When it comes to surface, it's actually really brackish, quite salty, no good for irrigation. Only in the most extreme drought conditions will sheep tolerate it as it's produced. And through the reverse osmosis water treatment plants that ourselves and the other projects have invested in, we're actually able to turn that 98% of that into permeate quality water that through Sunwater, the Queensland government-owned corporation, we're able to deliver to landowners in the region for irrigation purposes. So really good news story, and just a great example of good policy, good transparency, and then positive contribution to communities.
And I think, I mean, in that context, if you look at the last year, I mean, the drought is just heartbreaking for everyone. I mean, it's been running since 2012, and 66,000 megalitres of water made available to agriculture. And as Cecile says, I mean, that's water that wouldn't have otherwise been available to anyone. Combine that with payments to farmers last year in the vicinity of $80 million, almost $500 million over the last 10 years. I mean, if you're a farmer in the current circumstances that you find yourself in, I mean, these can literally be the difference between you staying on the land and not. And, I spent 25 years in agriculture. I've not met a farmer that doesn't want to stay on the land if given the opportunity. So, to be able to create those opportunities, I think, is an incredibly important thing to be able to do, and to work with the farmers, sensibly to make those resources available to them is absolutely crucial right now.
Got to see that firsthand. I think it was in Roma. We came round a corner. Brown, it was almost like a desert. We came round a corner. It was a green oasis. And it was because of that water that it previously wasn't cropping land. And it had these, all this green crop growing. And apparently the guy's very advanced with it. Has an irrigation system set up that he runs from Brisbane on an app on his phone. And a caretaker on the property.
Yeah, I'd add that, because of the and Cecile was joking earlier, or possibly not joking, the operations that we run are essentially water production and management operations, and gas is a kind of valuable byproduct. But when you look at the body of knowledge that we have today around how to manage water, how to manage the agricultural sciences of irrigation and cropping and so forth, there's been huge advances out there. I mean, and what we see in and around our leases is that the property values are actually higher on gas-bearing land, and many of our landowners and their neighbours want our water because it drought-proofs them. They don't want to leave the land; they want to stay there, and without that water that's been cleaned up and treated and so forth, they'd really be struggling. They'd be buying feed and or slaughtering cattle.
And that was, again, someone that's been in the media and heard the stories over the years, to go out there and hear these farmers actually at these gatherings say that it's kept us on the land. We've had a property in the family for generations. We thought at one stage we'd have to get off it and lose it, but it's kept them there. So it was some amazing stories out there. I will ask, back in the early days, what have you learned in terms of, I guess, the approaches made and the social licence when it comes to accessing properties for the gas industry?
Yeah, Bill, I think you made a really good point that many of these properties have been held in families for several generations. And whilst we have a legislative regime that separates the freehold title from the resources within the ground, I think it's of fundamental importance that that we work with those landowners, that we're stepping onto not just their business but their family home. And so I think the development of codes of practice for how you engage with landowners has been a really positive development over the last few years. But I also think the way that all of the participants work with landowners around the placement of wells on their properties, whereas I think in its infancy, it was more a desktop exercise and a sort of a grid layout. At the time, again, Queensland at that point was coming out of a 10-year drought as well, and the revenue that came from those wells was what was the difference between survival and not for some of those families. But I think it's with a great source of pride that we can look now at the way we conduct our surveys with landowners to find the best location for wells and for roads and for access points, and the code of conduct for landowner relations has really made a big difference.
And just adding to that, because I totally agree, if you look through the last decade, the early years, there's no doubt the industry made huge mistakes, and I don't think the industry really resolves from that. because you're trying to spend $70 billion really quickly. And that's an awful lot of money on an hourly rate or a daily rate to spend. And building kit in Gladstone, building massive pipelines, and with all that going on, your project teams are under pressure to deliver the well infrastructure, to deliver the gas to the plants. And I think that pressure, in hindsight, you had influx of contractors who didn't understand Western Queensland, didn't understand anything other than the city, actually, probably realistically. You had gates that were left open, and anyone who's been in a farm or understands farming, you don't leave a gate open or you leave it the way it was left. And in some cases, it's very small things that get repeated that just really blow up the relationship for a long time. And to Cecile's point, what's been amazing to see over that huge period of activity, so naturally tailing off, which I think is positive as well. But the industry, has learnt by osmosis and the behavioural practices internally rather than just legislative things that we need to deal with, number one. But secondly also, Siri has... Sorry, I've got to turn Siri off.
Found a new gas deposit somewhere.
Siri literally went, here's what I found. So what's also happened also with the work that's going in much more steady state these days is we've hired a lot more locals. The local employment of the industry has really created partnerships on the land because they live in Roma, they live in Chinchilla, they live in Miles. And you, over the years, your junior guys and gender neutral, junior guys who we've hired over the years are now the senior staff, the supervisors or the superintendents who have those long enduring relationships with landholders, and it's just been brilliant to see.
I don't keep making it about my trip out there, but again, on that point, we were driving down the street and it was an Origin vehicle, and amazing the amount of yellow shirts that would just wave at the... had no idea who was in it, but they'd wave, and the woman driving, she said that happens all the time because they're proud to work in the industry, and she said it's been something that she's noticed changed over the years. She's been involved for a while, since the sort of practices and the engagement has improved. So yeah,
I think. Sorry, Bill. Just to add on that. I mean, I think, as Ian said, we shouldn't gloss over the challenge that we created for ourselves as well. And I think we're still having to work through the elements of that. And I don't suspect for 1 minute that we're out of the woods, and you're only as good as your last performance. And I think as an industry, we've got to continue to make sure that we work with the landholders and work with the local communities to make sure that we continue to do the right things. And so the legislative framework is important, but it is about making sure that we really push through the organisations that we all work for as well, the importance of doing that, because from a reputation point of view, it's perception and performance, and we've got to get both right, and we can't for 1 minute, I suppose, allow ourselves to get complacent that we've got it right, because the needs of these communities will continue to change as well.
Yep, sorry.
Oh, Andrew, I was just going to say, you're absolutely right. The social licence, like a reputation, is built over time, but it can be lost instantly, and actually it can be lost not necessarily by your own individual actions, but by any member of our community. And I think that's why the degree of collaboration, the sharing of best practice, and the sense of being a family that needs to deliver safely and sustainably together is so important.
I'll ask a couple more questions, and we might open it to a few of the media that have joined us in the room today. Criticism over domestic supply, rising prices in the gas industry. Is that a real thing? And talk of a possible running out of supply or a shortage of supply by 2025? And what sort of settings do you need in place to balance the needs for export gas and domestic gas? A few questions there.
Yeah, so I'll start with what the industry in Queensland has very successfully done over the last 5-6 years is significantly improve our unit cost performance. So what that means is that we can now access resource that was sub-economic just a few short years ago. Our well costs have come down 80-odd%, our operating costs down 50%, those sorts of numbers. And what that does is it extends our ability to go and chase some of those what were more marginal resources in collaboration with the Queensland Government, who continue to make new acreage available, which is an essential ingredient in providing domestic supply. Now, when you look south, the story isn't the same. You know, with the moratoria that Ian mentioned before, you know, the solution to mitigating and preventing gas price escalation domestically is more supply locally. And ideally, it's not importing our own gas from the West Coast. It's about developing it domestically, as we're doing in Queensland. We hope to in New South Wales and Northern Territory and so forth. But you know, the industry is certainly playing its part in driving to be able to develop more marginal plays. And as long as we have that relationship with the government and the communities, you know, keeping that relationship strong, I think you know, the East Coast gas market has a long way to run.
A couple of comments. Let me get some background first, because what's talked about a lot is binary conversations. It's renewables or it's fossil fuels. It's electricity or it's gas. It's onshore or it's offshore. The complex market that is the national electricity market for electricity, the national energy market for fossil fuels and gas in particular. It is very complex, and we get compared a lot. Australia gets compared a lot to, well, why can't we have prices like the US? And a bit of a history lesson in Australia. The reason we had low prices originally in Australia was there was a liquids business from the Cooper Basin, a liquids business from the Gippsland. And when I say liquids, oil, fundamentally. And we had this byproduct that was really hard to deal with called gas. And what do we see today in the Permian Basin in the US in particular is this huge oil business with this thing that's associated with it called gas. So in some cases recently, you've had producers having to pay suppliers to take gas because they physically didn't have the infrastructure to move away. And what the US has been able to do, of course, is give birth to a whole range of manufacturing and even LNG exports from the US. Australia, by contrast, had that 40, 50, 60 years ago. And as the traditional sources of supply have come off in southern markets, so the Gippsland in particular, you're seeing those sources of associated cheap gas, in inverted commas, come off, and now your main level of main supply coming in into southern markets from Queensland is dry. There is no associated there's no associated liquids. It is 99% methane. And there are no sort of economic uplifts from the liquids business that have traditionally been there. So what you're seeing, unfortunately, is rising base prices coming through the entire East Coast. And there is parity towards international prices, that's a fact. And as an economy, an Australian economy, we've benefited massively. But there are some movements around particular industries that, because of the speed of this happen, we've struggled to deal with. And this is part of the debate we're having now.
Maybe just quickly, you touched on it there before, David. How long can we rely on the Surat Basin? What's the supply, and what sort of things are all businesses doing to unlock new sources, I guess?
Yeah, so I think Ian mentioned earlier, you know, many of these very, you know, multi-billion-dollar investments were made on 20-plus year field life assumptions. As I said before, the industry's done a remarkable job of improving unit cost, and again, that pulls in you know, more marginal acreage. And so, you know, I personally think there's multi-decade running room just in Queensland alone. But then you look at other kind of gas resources around the country. There's a lot of gas in Australia, and you know, if we get it right, it can really underpin the Australian economy for generations to come, as is exactly what's happening in the US today. You know, that economy is booming on the basis of low-cost energy, and it is also one of the very few countries, if not the only country in the world, on target to beat its Kyoto targets.
Yeah, I think the Surat is clearly a world-class resource, and although there's been vast sums of money already invested in the infrastructure and the wells there, the story is by no means over. We said in the introduction that Santos is drilling a record 300, 350 wells this year. Over the last couple of years, QGC has drilled between 300 and 400 wells. In February this year, we commenced drilling on Project Gugabinge, which is another 250 wells, deliver 930 PJs of additional gas, and we're well advanced in plans to sanction the next wave of development within that project, another 330 wells. So that wave of investment within the project will continue. Really exciting times as we're starting some new joint ventures with Santos outside of our traditional acreage source, some of which is dedicated to the domestic market, was granted by licence with those domestic market conditions, and the companies were very excited to have the opportunity to bid on those together, but also some new frontier plays that we're hoping to open up together.
Is the Northern Territory, is there some exciting developments coming up there? This is a question not on the list, but I just heard from an engineer friend of mine that there's a possibility that some of the oldest gas seams in the world may be able to be tapped there at some stage.
Yeah, so in the MacArthur Basin particularly, and South Nicholson, which is kind of straddles the border between Northern Territory and Queensland, I think they're Proterozoic shales, so 1.5 billion years old roughly. So arguably the oldest productive shales in the world. There has been some early exploration success, and the gas in place in these basins is absolutely extraordinary. You know, if you look at the gas in place in some of the big gas, shale gas plays in the US, you could probably take the top 3 or 4 and put them together, and those are the sorts of volumes we're talking about. Clearly, where they are located, we suffer a little bit from the tyranny of distance, but this country and our industry has a lot of really smart, capable people, and at some point those resources, I'm sure, will be developed, and we certainly want to be part of that.
Okay, well, this all answered all the questions fantastically. Is some of the media in the room, would you like to throw a question at our guests? We've got a microphone at the back there, so you don't have to yell out. So just put your hand up and we'll bring the microphone over to you. Anybody? All shy? No?
G'day, Michael McKenna from the Australian newspaper. I'm sorry, I've just arrived. I'm replacing the resources reporter here, so I'm winging it. Earlier you were quite effusive about the collaboration that the industry has got with the Queensland government, but it's true, isn't it, that the government snuck up on you this year, and Queensland did, and increased the royalties by 25%. There was some criticism at the time that this would damage certainty for investors and make it less, well, they couldn't trust the government or what's going on. So can you comment on that, please?
Yes.
Yes, they snuck up on you?
Yes. No, look, I think, at the end of the day, governments are want to do what governments are want to do, and the Treasurer saw that this was an opportunity to address both perhaps the quantum of royalties and also the operation of the royalty regime, and we're yet to work through that process. And if that's the framework we work in, then of course it's our job to make our concerns known and then move forward, and that's constructively what we're now seeking to do. I think the point that I made several times in the media was exactly the point you just made, Michael. It's what industry struggles with is uncertainty, because uncertainty increases risk, and then risk needs to be priced, and that's the real challenge here. And I think, yes, it certainly would have been more beneficial if we'd been able to work through with the government what that adjustment could look like, and how we could perhaps manage that in a smoother way. But we are now where we are, and I would say that since then we've been able to work constructively with government. We're still awaiting what the final review panel will look like, but I think it does now present an opportunity for us to get in and look at the overall operation of the regime. But it was a surprise. We made that known at the time. We made our displeasure known at the time. But then we have to move on. It went through Parliament, the joys of a single house Parliament here in Queensland. It was always going to go through, so then you just got to move on. But repeatedly the point we always make is uncertainty increases risk, risk increases price, and that's that's the challenge here. And the point about New South Wales, I mean, one of the ironic things was I was down talking to Matt Keane, the Environment and Energy Minister in New South Wales, about 2 weeks after that happened, and I did sort of happen to ask him how he felt that he was now paying Queensland's tax, but I think that point was lost on him.
Can I just ask a couple of the executives rather than the association guy who's paid to...
Oh, you saw that,
I
did
say
you?
that with respect.
So look, ultimately you go back to the basis of royalties. The state owns the resource. So when a piece of land has resource in it, it's owned by the state. That's the constitution, that's the way it is. And the way that the bargain, if you like, gets struck is there's a tenement that's, or a permit that's given to a resource company, and if they find a discovery and they're able to produce, they're able to make revenue from that discovery, but they pay a royalty to government. And it's completely in government's gift to decide what that royalty is. And it's completely in industry's gift to decide how it responds to the fiscal terms of the day, and capital is mobile.
So how do you explain this to your investors internationally? Because there was, go back to Rudd, there was the mining rents tax. Again, that was said to be an ambush, and these are very important industries that provide a lot of job and a lot of infrastructure. So just trying to get an answer here in what do you tell your investors about certainty now, given that this has happened and it could happen again?
Happy to take that again. Look, I think, to be honest, I think it's pretty straightforward. One day you're paying 10%, the next day you're paying 12.5%. And ultimately that cost has to be borne by someone. Part of the cost is borne by the company, part of the cost is borne by the end user. And that's just the way the economics works. I don't think it's that complicated from that point of view, and I don't think the investors I think investors are quite sophisticated creatures as a general rule, and understand the way the Federation works.
Confident that it won't happen again in the next, say, 5-10 years, which is usually your outlook?
It's like saying you're confident you're not going to have a storm tomorrow. Who knows? Ultimately, what you want is certainty, and private enterprise, especially in a country like Australia that's reliant on foreign capital and reliant on mobile capital being put into a particular place, the fiscal rules of the road, if you like, you want them to be stable. And for the most part, I think Australia does a reasonable job, certainly from international benchmark. There has been many a bump in the road. I think you alluded to a few, but I think ultimately we end up in a position where the rules of the road are relatively okay, and investment can be put in understanding those rules. But I go back to my comments around the national electricity, national energy market earlier on. The reason there's no investment in baseload power currently is because we don't know what the rules are. So you're not going to invest for 20 or 30 years if you don't understand the rules. And there's a lot of debate going on at the moment around that. That's just a case in point of that not quite working as it currently should. Queensland, I think, over the last decade or decade and a half, has done a fantastic job of maintaining stability and showing real political mettle on both sides of the aisle, supporting an industry both fiscally in terms of stability, but also regulatory wise in terms of rules, that has enabled what we're getting up to, nearly 100 billion. So I think the history speaks for itself.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Any other questions? Any immediate? Yep. We've got...
Good afternoon, Hayden Johnson from the Courier Mail. Thanks for your time. I just wonder, you mentioned before, David, about Santos and its New South Wales project. Just wondering how the panel thinks, should that be approved, how will that affect future investment in Queensland's gas exploration market? Can you just shed some light on what we might see if New South Wales and Victoria, as you put before, open the floodgates?
Sure. So, we're optimistic that we'll get a favourable determination, as I mentioned before, earlier this year, we are actively preparing to allocate capital to that. That will not affect our investment profile in Queensland. We have obviously a business plan to explore and develop resources in Queensland. Now, if New South Wales works, it'd be nice to have some challenges around choices. We'd love to have some really good investment opportunities in New South Wales as well as we have in Queensland, South Australia, and hopefully the Northern Territory.
Yeah, I think I'd just supplement that by saying the health of the industry is absolutely going to be enhanced by having a growth in supply sources and a growth in suppliers. The industry, particularly in Queensland, went through a really heavy period of consolidation, both to acquire the tenures to support the LNG projects. But I personally would really love to see a greatly reinvigorated junior and mid-cap explorer sector. I think they play a really, really important role in our industry. And I think the signposts of getting approvals for projects like Narrabri send some really positive signals to the explorers within our industry, because they put a vast amount of risk capital on the table, and if they can't see a monetisation route, then molecules that are discovered but not brought to market don't keep those companies afloat. And so I would just positively say the more projects that we see get up and get moving, I think that we will just add to the vibrancy of the industry.
Another question at all?
Still winging it.
So are we.
Doing really well.
Watching the federal election and the lead up to the federal election last year, there was discussion about electricity prices, about energy, and this dovetailed into your industry. And Pauline Hanson and others criticised the industry because, particularly in Queensland, that you were spending, or that you were exporting more than you sold locally. And I'm not sure if this is right, that you could buy gas in China for cheaper than what it is here. So I'm just wondering, were there mistakes in what you did in building this great industry in Queensland, which, as everyone acknowledges, brings royalties, brings jobs and the like. But should there have been more gas allocated domestically? And what's the plan for the future?
So I'd just start with perhaps a little bit of a history lesson. The Queensland, and I'm sure most people in the room know this, the Queensland coal seam gas resources would not have been developed under the prevailing gas prices that existed. Australia's East Coast domestic market, by international standards, is tiny, and it was dominated by Bass Strait, and again, essentially Bass Strait for the first, 25, 30 years of its life was really an oil play with associated gas. Now that gas clearly went into the domestic market because there was no export for it, and a very small East Coast domestic market was essentially flooded with low-cost Bass Strait gas and also gas coming out of the Cooper Basin. The coal seam gas deposits in Queensland really needed the higher international LNG prices to be developed, and I would assert that as a result of that, we have uncovered sources of supply and are producing sources of supply into the domestic market, that probably would not have been developed but for the CSG developments on the back of LNG export. And I think Ian mentioned before, we already have domestic reservation in terms of certain lease blocks, production licences that are dedicated to domestic supply. And so again, I'd assert that the CSG LNG projects have actually freed up and brought to market domestic gas that otherwise probably would never have been developed.
I think just to build on that, I mean, I just want to address fundamentally this question. You know, that gas is cheaper in Taiwan or Korea or China. It is just not the case. You know, IEA studies, other studies have shown that Australia sits right in the middle globally in terms of the price of gas here domestically versus overseas, and the price here is, you know, on average $4 to $5 and sometimes $6 cheaper. So, you know, when lies and damn statistics in terms of, you know, how those numbers are actually reported, but, you know, there is evidence coming out our ears that it is just not the case. So I think that's the first point. Second point, building on what was just said, you know, there is in place a regulatory and policy framework through the ADGSM, and then related to that, a heads of agreement which says that, you know, any uncontracted gas is first made available to the domestic market on competitive terms. So, you know, there is a framework there that looks at the supply obligations and makes sure that they are met, in addition to the domestic policy regime here in Queensland as well. So, you know, I think it's important that we are clear as to what the reality is versus what the perception is.
Yeah, and I think as part of meeting those obligations, you know, there are 6 fantastic LNG trains on Curtis Island with really high reliability and performance capacity. They're not operating at full capacity, not because there's not enough gas being produced in the upstream, but because there have been really conscious decisions to divert molecules that might otherwise have flown through our LNG facilities to support the domestic market, to support our obligations under the ADGSM and the heads of agreement, but actually they were flowing that way even before that regulatory intervention. So I think that you know, we have a domestic market that is fully supplied, and we have an industry that deeply and fundamentally understands that in order to have a sustainable long-term export business, we've got to have a well-functioning and well-supplied domestic market.
Thank you. Okay, we're almost out of time. Any other questions? Yep.
G'day guys, Ben Smee from Guardian Australia. I want to ask you, do you expect or perhaps predict that climate activism will pivot to focus on the gas industry in the near future, or perhaps at any point in the future? And perhaps in particular for the executives on stage, do your business plans or strategic plans consider the risk to your businesses that the world will perhaps pivot away from fossil fuels more quickly than is currently predicted?
Sure, I'll take that. So I think in the first instance, and it was discussed earlier, you know, the role of gas in the fuel mix is critical, and you know, we accept that climate change is a reality. We accept the science behind that, and our view is that natural gas is part of the solution. The world will not arrive at a carbon neutral, or maybe even one day a carbon free state without natural gas underpinning the development of renewables. And to that end, we absolutely recognise that the future does not look much like the past, and our business plans account for that. And we certainly spend a lot of time trying to understand, you know, what are the future scenarios, how do they play out, and what's our role in them. To that end, we're doing a lot of work in the Cooper Basin right now around carbon CO2, so carbon dioxide, as a medium for enhanced oil recovery in the first instance, but in the longer term future for sequestration. And so, you know, we're looking at how can we essentially drive towards a carbon neutral future for ourselves, because, you know, we recognise that it's ultimately coming, and gas is a huge part of enabling that future. The other point I'd make is that if all of the LNG that was exported by Australia each year went into power generation in China and Japan, displacing higher emission fuel sources, the industry would contribute to offsetting 300 million tonnes of CO2 emissions out of China and Japan each year. Just to put that in some context, Australia's annual emissions are around 550 to 570 million tonnes per year. So 300 million tonnes if all of our LNG exports were turned to power gen. And that is a huge impact in what is a global problem. Last I looked, it was not an Australian issue, it is a global problem. And you know, that is the contribution that our industry could and does make. So to answer your question simply, yes, we spend a lot of time thinking about this and about our role in a carbon neutral future.
I think I'd just add to that. I think there's absolutely no doubt that our energy system needs to transition from one that for the last 100, 120 years has been founded on hydrocarbon molecules to one that is based upon lower carbon sources and is really dominated not by hydrocarbon but by electrons. I think that indeed it's been a huge area of focus for Shell. As many of you might know, for the last 50, 60 years, we've generated scenarios. For the last 20 years or more, we've been calling for a price on carbon. I think 1991 was the first time that Shell was public in that aspiration. So as we look at that role of gas in the future, under all of our projections, 2030, 2050, 2070, we see a really long-term continuing role for gas in the energy mix. Of course, none of us can predict the pace of that transition, and in fact, it's going to happen at different paces in different places around the world. But what is clear to Shell is that gas will be the fuel around which that energy transition pivots. So, you know, the merits of gas over coal are well rehearsed in terms of its lowest carbon emitting hydrocarbon, its ability to have fast response power generation from it. But really, I guess, what we need to look at as an industry is even if every car and every appliance, anything that has a plug in the world now was converted to renewable energy, there would still be a role for gas in our energy mix. Currently, only 20% of global energy demand comes from electricity. And Shell, we see that growing significantly over the coming decades, and we see that being sourced predominantly from renewable sources. However, the role that gas and other energy-dense hydrocarbons play in the broader energy mix will continue, and it's important that we do that in a way that manages those emissions, but also is unashamed about the benefits that our industry and that hydrocarbons more generally bring to society as a whole.
Just on the activist question, Ben Moe, to finish. I mean, yeah, look, I do think the activists will continue to turn towards the natural gas sector as well. It's been quite a progression, and all of the hallmarks of things that make our industry attractive to activists are there. You know, I've had the misfortune to work in agriculture, banking, and now oil and gas, and trouble seems to follow you wherever you go. But you know, all the hallmarks are there. I think the key for the industry is to be prepared to have the conversation. As Ian said, it's not about either or, it's about and. And I think being prepared to sit down, listen, have the conversation, be prepared to engage. Absolutely agree where you can agree and disagree where you disagree. But, you know, to stand there and just throw rocks at each other is not going to work, and that's not the way to the future. So I think we have to be prepared for it, and we have to be prepared to have a slightly different conversation and get the right people in the room to have that conversation. So, you know, it is part of our future, and we're just going to have to embrace it and learn how to deal with those groups as well.
Yeah, I think just absolutely on that front. So when Shell articulates its strategic levers, you know, we see the three key limbs of our strategy being a world-class investment case, thriving through the energy transition, and having a strong societal licence to operate. Now, the reality is that in the short term, as you look to reshape your portfolio, that can create some hard choices and some trade-offs. But over the medium and longer term, those three elements of strategy actually become mutually reinforcing. And I'd put it to, certainly it's a question we ask ourselves, but I think all of my industry colleagues would agree that as we look forward through the energy transition, you're not going to be able to maintain that world-class investment case unless indeed you have thrived through the energy transition and unless you maintain that strong social licence to operate that we've spent so much time talking about today.
Definitely the final one. So what do you say to Extinction Rebellion protesters then that seem to be targeting? They've targeted Santos, I think, last week. There were arrests out the front of the building. You're a target along with government. What do you say to them?
I think we'd say first and foremost, they, like everybody else, have every right to protest and make their voices heard. We understand their motivations. We agree that urgent action on climate change is required. What we'd ask them to do is to listen, to engage with us, to get into the facts, and likewise, as Andrew said, for us to listen to their concerns. I think, you know, whether it's civil rights or women's votes or all sorts of things, often it's been the voice of youth that have been at the front end of that, and we shouldn't shy away from discordant voices.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to all four of you for taking all the questions today. They've been fantastic. Put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen, and thank Cecile, Andrew, David and Ian. Thanks very much. Well played. So we'll let you go down and you've earned a drink this afternoon now. That just about wraps it up, ladies and gentlemen. But if you'd like to see or have a look back at any of this today, it has been recorded at the back of the room, and you can visit the Queensland Media Club website and have a look at that. Thanks to JPL Media at the back of the room there. And once again, I just wanted to acknowledge our naming rights sponsors today, the Brisbane Airport Corporation, Dial Before You Dig, and our friends at Griffith University, as well as all of our other sponsors. So if you want to receive any other information about the Queensland Media Club or the season ahead, just drop the business card, your business card in the bowl. That's the registration desk, or you can see Peter Kelly, I'm sure, here, but have a chat with you, and you can find out all you need to know. So thanks very much once again to our guests and for coming along and being part of this luncheon today. Thank you.